Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar about 2017 completed trials, status quo or no. I'm Christine Blazynski. I'm Senior Product Manager for Informa Pharma Intelligence, and I'm joined by my colleague Laura Runkel, who is Associate Director for Autoimmune and Inflammation, as well as our CNS therapeutic area for our Sightline product. Please note this webinar is being recorded, so that if you must leave or encounter a technical difficulty, you will receive a recording and the slides as a registered attendee. And please do submit questions. We think there'll be time at the end to answer at least a few of these. We can also follow up individually by email with answers to your questions. So we're going to find out today if what happened with completed clinical trials last year represents the status quo as reported in analyses that I've done over the past few years, or if there's any change. The agenda is going to cover the overall landscape of the 2017 completed trials, looking at comparisons to past years, etc. We're also going to dig into those trials that were tagged by our Sightline analysts as having hit primary outcome, and we'll look at the top diseases, the sponsors, and I'll touch on biomarkers briefly. Then Laura is going to tell you about the analysis that she did on the primary drugs that were being studied in the trials that completed, and what those primary drugs can tell us about a company's specific strategy. And she will be digging down deep into oncology as part of this discussion. And finally, I'm going to return to a theme that I introduced last year, which was around co-sponsored trials. Last year, there was a suggestion that they saw higher success rates, and we'll see if that's the case this year. So without further ado, let's look at the trial landscape. The next slide shows you a table, and what I've included in this table are the absolute trial counts for each of the successive 3 years, and those are shown in the rightmost columns, the 3 rightmost columns. We took our data snapshot on February 13th of this year, and there were 3,534 trials. That data snapshot was taken then not by coincidence, because we took the 2016 completed trials data set snapshot on February 13th of 2017. There were about 100 fewer trials. And in 2015, there were about 500 fewer trials that completed. You can see the ranking by volume for each of the 3 years on the second, third, and fourth columns, and the take-home message really is that these rankings have remained unchanged. So definitely status quo. This slide I put in just as a reference point. I borrowed it from a colleague. The snapshot was taken at about the same time that we took our completed clinical trial snapshot, and it shows ongoing clinical trials by the therapeutic areas included in our trial trove product. What I really want you to focus on is the fact that oncology has over 6,000 ongoing trials here, and that's 3 times as many as any of the other therapeutic areas. When I look at the snapshot for the completed clinical trials in 2017, you can see, again, oncology is dominant. However, the magnitude of that dominance by no means has a threefold difference. So what this suggests is there's a lot that happens between the start or the announcement of the start of a clinical trial and getting to the goal line. And we will be looking at that now. So these are the diseases that had the largest numbers of clinical trials that completed for each successive year. The order of the diseases is ranked according to the absolute numbers of trials for 2017. And I show the rank of the disease in parentheses. you can see that type 2 diabetes trials have led the pack in each of the past 4 years, but those numbers are declining. The other three remaining diseases, or even 4 remaining diseases, that is, all are identical in the past 4 years, with the exception of nociceptive pain rising to 5th place in 2017. And this is due to the dramatic drop in trials for hepatitis C that were completed. And this is no doubt due to the fact that we now have marketed therapies that pretty much affect disease remission for hep C. What about the sponsors? So the money behind these trials that completed. And here you see the most prolific sponsors, and the rank order is based on the results from our 2017 data set. And you see that Roche moved into the winner spot. GlaxoSmithKline rose from show to place, and Novartis moved out of the top spot to 3rd. The big news is that Merck no longer enjoys the top five ranking, and it fell to 7th place. So now, what about trial success? I call this the who's who section of the webinar. And what you'll see here, again, is we're looking at success by disease. And the table shows the diseases with 25 or more trials that attained primary endpoints. Our Sightline analysts and subject matter experts review anything in the public domain that talks about a clinical trial results. And they add the outcome tags, and for a successful trial, it must be tagged with one tag that says that it met primary endpoint. Across the data set, the average success was 30.9%, so almost 1 out of every 3 trials was successful. Breast cancer ranked highest in terms of total trials, hitting primary endpoint. But when I normalize that to the absolute numbers of trials that completed, you see that the success rate was only 34.7%, so it fell to a 6th place in rank. Multiple myeloma, which had 26 trials that hit primary endpoint, enjoyed an over 50% success rate and holds the top spot. But amongst these diseases with 25 or more trials, oncology is represented 7 times. So it was a good year for oncology again. Now, what about sponsors? Those sponsors who had the largest numbers of trials that completed in our data set for 2017 completed trials are listed in this table. The rank order of the sponsors is dictated by the total completed trials, which you see in the second column from the right. The ranking is shown in parentheses. When I take the total number of trials that attained primary endpoint, and that is seen in the column that is 3rd from the right, and divide that by the total completed trials, I get a success rate. The success rate rankings for the various sponsors are shown in parentheses in that very last column on the right. The success rates ranged from 15 to 40% for this set of sponsors. And the top sponsors with successful trials were Novartis, Takeda, and Sanofi, with those success rates shown in parentheses. So you can see volume does not necessarily correlate with success. In the white paper, we discuss ignoring the phase 1 trials, and we did so because many phase 1 trials do not include efficacy endpoints. And this is really the criteria that our trial trove analysts are looking for when they assign an outcome to the clinical trial. When this data set is looked at, the success rates were 28.6 to nearly 53%. So you can see that's quite a jump from the success rate that includes all clinical trials. Takeda held the top rank at 53%. Rounding out the top 5 were Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, Novartis, and AstraZeneca, and their success rates are indicated by parentheses. Now I'm going to go do the deep dive into the top 3 therapeutic areas, beginning with oncology. And before we get into the top level metrics, I want to spend just a few seconds talking about the first couple of bullet points. I want to do this because you will see this list, these bullets on a couple other slides that follow. So what I've done is calculate the success rate across the entire data set, and so that was just under 31%. When I limit the data set to the top 3 therapeutic areas, the success rate slightly rose to 33.2%. When phase 1 trials were removed, the success rate took just about a 10% jump to 41.4%, and across the top 3 therapeutic areas, again you see that 10% bump to 42.3%. So keep these metrics in mind as we go through the slides around this deep dive section. When I limit the data set to only the oncology clinical trials, the success rate rose to 39.5%. So it was a significant increase compared to both the entire data set and compared to the top 3 therapeutic areas. When phase 1 trials were removed, that success rate jumped to 47.4%. The diseases with the 5 highest numbers of trials attaining primary endpoint are listed, and the numbers of trials are shown in the parentheses. Following that, you can see the diseases with the highest success rates. And there you see multiple myeloma, which we saw in an earlier slide, with its 56% success rate, followed by melanoma, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, and non-small cell lung cancer. And I think the take-home message is that looking at the top 5, the who's who amongst diseases with success, you see a different player, namely multiple myeloma, and you see a difference in the rank order amongst those diseases that also were tops just by volume. In 2016, the top successful diseases were colorectal cancer at 47.7%, prostate at 45%, and you can see that didn't even make the 2017 list, breast cancer at 43%, non-small cell lung cancer at 40%, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at 35%. So you can see that most of the diseases did a little better in 2016, with the exception of multiple myeloma, which was significantly higher in 2017. I've also teased the data apart to look at success rate by phase. And again, here's your metrics to hold as your benchmarks. And the diseases with the highest phase 2 success rates were non-small cell lung cancer, melanoma, and multiple myeloma. And for phase 3, the most successful diseases were ovarian cancer at 100%, but there were not that many trials for this. Colorectal cancer followed by breast cancer. There's something pretty amazing in this data, and that is if you look at this phase 3, almost every disease was at 50% or higher with the exception of liver cancer. So that means for these phase 3 oncology trials that completed, they did better than the flip of a coin. So it's a really nice story, I think, this year. Looking at the sponsors with the largest numbers of oncology trials and success, you can see Roche and Novartis outpace all the others with 95 and 80 completed trials, respectively. These sponsors also had the highest numbers of trials that hit primary endpoint at 38 and 34, respectively. But when you calculate those success rates, Takeda, Celgene, and Bristol-Myers Squibb are the top three sponsors. In 2016, the top sponsors that we presented had slightly higher success rates, with Johnson & Johnson at 65%, Otsuka at 61%, Amgen at 45%, and they didn't even make our list this year, Boehringer Ingelheim at 42%, and Celgene at 42%. So Celgene did slightly better in 2017 compared to 2016. Looking at the autoimmune therapeutic area, again, I show those metrics at the top. And across autoimmune, the success rate was just under 30%. And when I removed the phase 1 trials from the analysis, it rose to 40.5%, but those numbers are both slightly lower than across the top therapeutic area. I've listed those diseases with the highest numbers of trials that hit endpoint, and below that, the diseases with the highest success rate. So you can see trials that were looking at preventing rejection of transplants came in at 55%, so they did very, very well, followed by COPD. Looking back at 2016, COPD had 27 trials that hit endpoint, so that's slightly higher than we're reporting for 2017, but only a 20% success rate. So COPD more than doubled its success rate, so that's a real success story. Looking at the success by phase for those top diseases, you can see the rank order indicated here. And for phase 2, the top disease was led by other inflammatory arthritis. And those of you familiar with our Trialtrove product understand that this disease category represents an amalgamation of several other diseases, such as ankylosing spondylitis or psoriatic arthritis. For phase 3, the top disease successes were seen for transplantation. 3 out of 3 of their trials hit endpoint. A tie for second place between allergic rhinitis and other inflammatory arthritis, and COPD taking the third place position. The sponsors who were the pace setters in this therapeutic area are listed in this table, and again, it's listed in this table by absolute success rate. So you see that Novartis had the top success rate but only 13 of 28 trials hitting endpoint. AstraZeneca completed the largest numbers of trials last year, but ranked third by the metric of success. When I remove those phase 1 trials, the top 3 companies by volume also finish in the top 3 by rank, although the order differences. And I just want you to note how successful Novartis was when those phase 1 trials were removed. Looking at CNS, the success rate across that therapeutic area was 27%. So that was even lower than our autoimmune and inflammatory therapeutic area. And again, you see that 10% plus bump when you remove the phase 1 trials. Here, I've also listed the diseases with the 5 highest numbers of trials hitting endpoint, led by nociceptive pain, but there is significant overlap with neuropathic pain, so there's some double counting there. Epilepsy and migraine finished with each with 10 successful trials. Those diseases that had the highest success rates are listed here, and you see Parkinson's at 36.4% overall, 33% for phase 2, and 77.8% for phase 3. So those diseases did very well in phase 3. But I want you to notice migraine with its 90% success rate for phase 3. We know that a novel therapeutic has recently been approved and come onto the market, and this accounts for a lot of that trial success. The top sponsors by trial volume were Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, and Lundbeck. And the top sponsors by success rate were Otsuka, Lundbeck, and Allergan. So that really ends the trial landscape and the success analysis. And I'm going to hand over to Laura now so that she can. Laura just pointed out that I forgot to tell you about biomarkers, which I promised to do. And I'll do that very briefly. And what I'm showing here in the top graph is data from just the top 3 therapeutic areas, and these are trials that received a tag from our Sightline analysts. The take-home message is, for across the 3 therapeutic areas, the success rate was 33%. When I take a subset of that data, namely those trials that contained that were tagged with a biomarker tag, that means any biomarker tag that is available in TrialTrove, that subset had a success rate that rose to 41.5%. So clearly, trials that involve biomarkers continue to have a higher level of success, which I've reported in prior years. By far, oncology involves the largest numbers of trials with biomarkers. And in this slide, I've just compared 2 particular biomarkers, and you can see the outcome tags by phase that have been applied by our colleagues at TrialTrove. So for efficacy biomarkers, phase 2 success rate was 45% and 58% for phase 3. When I look at those trials that were tagged with biomarkers for patient stratification or pre-selection, you could see that the phase 2 success rate rose to 50%, and the phase 3 again was at 58%. So biomarkers clearly are having a positive effect on these trials. Now I'm going to hand over to Laura so that she can tell you about the analysis that we did on strategy that sponsors are using.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great overview of the clinical landscape. And I wanted now to turn to what a more granular analysis of the very same data might be able to tell us about the sponsor strategies used in these trials. Last year, Chris pioneered the tagging of particular strategies based on the mechanism of action for the primary drug. So, for example, if a drug had never been tested in that disease before, it had a novel mechanism of action. We also this year used the label expansion strategy, tagging again. This is for when a approved drug is being now tested in a different indication. And these are both strategies that would result in some new therapeutic options for the patients should they prove positive. This year we included a few changes in our strategy tagging. We incorporated a new one called life cycle management. This is when the study drug was already approved in the particular indication of the trial, and the study now aims to demonstrate additional efficacy or safety outcomes within that indication. And this is actually quite commonly used to expand the application for the drug within that same disease, make the most of it once it's been approved. Last year we used the Me Too strategy to tag drug trials where the mechanism was not novel. It was already approved for another drug, but now there's another version of it. This year we've included the generics and the biosimilars along together with these in the Me Too strategy. And finally, the novel formulation is a new strategy that we tagged this year. This is used for novel fixed-dose combinations and also for novel delivery systems. These are two types of strategies that we see commonly in certain indications. So the approach that we took was to look at the top 3 therapeutic areas by trial counts and focus on tagging the trials that had efficacy endpoints. So these would be phase 1-2 out to phase 4. And you can see in the histogram depiction of the numbers where for each therapeutic area the strategies are broken out, that they look quite different. The profiles are strikingly focused in oncology on the novel and the label expansion strategy. There is some indication of Me Too activity in there as well, with basically 19% of the trials evaluating a mechanism of action that's already been demonstrated to be effective, maybe a generic or a follow-on. Now, turning to autoimmune, well, first of all, I should just point out that this dominant strategy of novel and label expansion accounts to 80% of the trial activity from last year's numbers. That's quite high, of course. Looking at autoimmune and inflammation, the profile is quite different. The predominant strategy is the Me Too strategy, and this is likely because we have a lot of chronic diseases with established therapeutics, large markets for, say, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, among others, and there's a lot of competition to gain access with proven mechanisms of action. So this would account for why I believe the Me Too strategy is so popular in autoimmune. There's also some significant label expansion and novel activity, but it only amounts to 37% of the trials, less than half of what we saw with oncology as a percentage of the total. The life cycle management strategy is also very commonly used in autoimmune, and this is, again, expanding efficacy and safety being demonstrated for approved drugs in their approved indications. For CNS, the profile is somewhat similar to AI, and probably for the same reasons. There are well-established mechanisms of action for approved drugs, and there's a lot of competition in the Me Too category to gain some market access with new products competing there. Also, that's true for life cycle management, where they're expanding their use within that given indication. So both of these much more than what you see for those strategies in oncology. For CNS, there is a higher percentage of novel and label expansion activity during this period, 46%, so just about half of the trials there. I just wanted to point out the novel formulations for AI and CNS are commonly used as well, and this would be the fixed-dose combinations that we often see for respiratory diseases. And in CNS, there's a lot of reformulations for pain medications and for novel delivery systems. So this is likely accounting for that higher activity there. Moving on to the more granular analysis to see by breaking out according to phase where these strategies are most observed. The Me Too strategy in autoimmune, as I mentioned, is the predominant strategy, and it's quite high in phase 2 and in phase 3. This is likely because the category is including both unapproved drugs with a proven mechanism of action who would be running phase 2 and phase 3 trials, as well as generics and biosimilars, which would likely be mostly the phase 3 trials. The novel drugs are more predominantly in the phase 2 stage right now, with threefold higher phase 2 than in phase 3. The life cycle management strategy is applied most often in phase 3 trials, and this makes sense when we think that this drug was already approved in that indication, so they're running additional trials of late stage in that area. The novel formulations, where here it's interesting that the phase 3s are higher than the phase 2s numbers, and I wanted to sort of call out some of the success stories for AI during this past year. And Chris already highlighted how COPD had a very high success rate, and there were some triple drug combinations that proved effective in severe COPD that attained primary endpoints during this period. In the novel arena, there were a couple JAK kinase inhibitors that were approved, but generally, I think the main focus, as we can see, is on claiming market share with the Me Too and the label the life cycle management. The profile of the phases for the different strategies for CNS are shown here. The novel drug strategy was the predominant one. It edged out the Me Too by just a little bit, but we can see that it's about a twofold higher number of phase 2 studies than phase 3 for the novel. The Me Too strategy is very much like what I just described for autoimmune, where it's a combination of new drugs with a proven mechanism of action, as well as generics and maybe to a lesser extent biosimilars here. And so they would be scattered across phase 2 and phase 3. And again, like AI, you see the life cycle management is high in phase 3, and it's also for the very same reason that they're claiming some market share and expanding their claims in these chronic diseases, large markets. You can see here, too, that the novel formulations in phase 3 are actually higher than in the phase 2 numbers. Looking at what those were in development last year reveals that primarily these were reformulated opioid pain medications, as well as some modified release forms of drugs for movement disorders and epilepsy and some of the associated problems with dementia and neurodegenerative diseases. The main success story this year was the novel drugs antagonizing the calcitonin gene-related pathway. Those were novel, so that's for migraine, and it really was the success story for CNS. Moving on to oncology, we'll just start looking, first of all, at the overview, as I mentioned, and then we'll move in to a little bit more granular analysis for some of the oncology trends during this period from the strategy perspective. As I mentioned earlier, about 80% of the trials total were novel and label expansion. You can see how they break out according to the phases. The phase 2s are higher than the phase 3s. And as what we saw with the Me Too strategy for the other therapeutic areas, again, that activity is sort of broken out by into both phase 2 and phase 3 for the same reasons. I wanted to highlight which sponsors were the main ones according to the number of mid to late stage oncology trials. These were the sponsors that had 15 or more later stage trials, and we took a closer look at the data to see what strategies they were using here. And as you can see, the main strategies were novel and label expansion. However, looking down at the bottom line here for label expansion, was greater than 15% of the trials were using that approach, but still quite a lot of novel activity here as well. These particular sponsors were the main ones that Chris had highlighted earlier, but there are also three sponsors that had a more dominant focus on the novel strategy approach, and these are Bristol-Myers Squibb, AstraZeneca, and GlaxoSmithKline. Another way of looking at the strategy and where it was applied is shown here. We have the trial counts for the past year according to which disease they were evaluated in, both for the novel and for the label expansion approach. And in the top histograms, you can see in the pink bars, these are the trial counts overall for the novel, and then the purple bars are the subset that had returned positive trial outcomes. And the squiggly gray line is the overall success rate, so the percent of those trials that had reached their primary endpoints. And just a quick look across the two graphs, you can see that the patterns are quite different, novel versus label expansion, in terms of which diseases were being targeted by the novel versus the label expansion. In addition, if you look a little bit more closely at what the success rates were, one way of looking at it would be to look at how many of these diseases actually achieved greater than 30% positive outcomes. And in this case, for the novel, you can see that there were 4 diseases that attained that level. However, assessing the label expansion approach, you see that there's actually a higher percentage of a higher number of diseases that reach that milestone. So in this case, there are, I believe, 11 diseases that were successful in this analysis. So it appears in general that the label expansion approach, and this is for phase 2 to phase 4, was more successful during this time period and across a wider range of diseases. A final piece to dig in even just a little bit deeper into what we can learn from the strategies is to break out of the oncology winners. These are the novel and label expansion studies that had achieved primary endpoints in pivotal trials. So these are mostly phase 3 trials, but also pivotal phase 2 were included in here. The text under the names of the diseases are color-coded according to whether they were novel or whether they were label expansions. I could just give you the bottom line that out of these 25 trials that were run, 13 of them were for label expansion and 12 were new drugs. And so looking at it this way, it was almost a 50-50 breakout according to which ones had actually attained primary endpoints, could be bringing new drugs onto the market, as just looking at the phase 3. To summarize what we have just gone through with the strategy, I wanted to just highlight how you can look very closely into the details once you have a strategy assigned. And I think what we saw highlighted a difference between the therapeutic areas that was quite clear. Within oncology, there are a lot more of energy and resources going into new therapeutics through novel and label expansion strategies, whereas the therapeutic areas of AI and CNS that have more chronic diseases and some established mechanisms of action really focus on a lot of energy on claiming more market share and claiming greater efficacy outcomes across that approved indication. So I would just say that for AI and CNS, if you would like to see a similar analysis of the granular details of disease focus and label expansion versus novel, you can see that analysis in the white paper. And so with that, I believe we'll turn it back over to Chris to wrap up with the final stage.
Thanks, Laura. That was really, really an interesting analysis. Okay, so I'm going to return to a theme that I introduced last year, which was around co-sponsorship. That is, trials that have more than one industry sponsor, and do they make a difference? Before I get to the end, what I wanted to include is a table that you will find in our white paper, and this represents a bit different analysis that we did this year as opposed to other years. And we had assistance with this from our colleague Doro Shin, who helped us automatically insert labels into our data set as to whether a sponsor was one of a top 20 sponsor or any other sponsors and any other industry sponsor that fell outside the top 20. Top 20 was defined as the highest revenue, highest sales by pharmaceutical sales, as listed in our most recent Scrip 100 publication, which is a recurring publication that is widely read in the industry. The take-home message here is that for our 2017 completed trials data set, that the vast majority of those trials were sponsored by a sole sponsor. So there were over 1,400 trials that were sponsored by a top 20 company and nearly 1,700 trials that were sponsored by any other pharma company. You can see the numbers listed for combinations within top 20, be they 2 or 3, combinations amongst any other pharma, and then we also looked for combinations between the two classes of sponsors. And again, the data really says that, for the most part, the trials were done by single sponsors. So what happened last year in 2017? There were a total of 2,092 trials that completed across the 3 top therapeutic areas. 356 of these had more than one industry sponsor. It really didn't matter, top 20, any other combinations of them. 107 of these trials met primary endpoint for a 30% success rate. This was below the success rate for the top 3 therapeutic areas. So definitely not the status quo. And just to remind you, last year in our analysis, which we did across all therapeutic areas, trials that had more than one industry sponsor reported a 46.5% success rate. So very, very different story for 2017 compared to 2016, not the status quo. However, there were hints that perhaps co-sponsorship might be suggestive of success. And this table looks familiar, I'm sure. Laura showed this, and I just modified it to look at the trials that hit primary endpoint. I've included 3 footnotes. The bottom line here is that Novartis had 24 trials that hit primary endpoint, with 5 of them being co-sponsored with GlaxoSmithKline. It's 20%. GlaxoSmithKline had 11 trials that hit primary endpoint. Again, 5 sponsored with Novartis, so just under 50%. And Celgene's 16 trials that were successful had 5 co-sponsors, so above 33%. So you may be digging into the deep data in a more granular way might tease that out, but at least in a way that you could apply any kind of math or statistical terms, it doesn't look like co-sponsorship is making an impact, at least for 2017. We'll clearly look at this again next year. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. We decided to focus on 4 major themes, and we hope that in doing so, we really put together a nice jigsaw puzzle for you and demonstrated the power of looking at completed clinical trials and finding the stories that exist. We thank you for your attention. We have time for questions, and I'm going to hand off to Laura to answer to start answering the questions, or at least talking about the questions. If you have a question and have time to send it in, please do. Otherwise, you can use the email address shown here to send those questions in. That email will find its way to Laura and I, and we'll be happy to get back to you. So thank you, and here's Laura again.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We do have 2 questions here, and I'll start with this one. With all the news around failures of the late-stage Alzheimer's trials, you stated that there were 18 trials that were successful. What were they, and were any novel at the time the trials initiated? So there were 4 successful phase 3 trials, of which 2 were sponsored by Lundbeck and Otsuka. This was for their brexpiprazole testing agitation. The other trials were looking at behavioral or cognitive endpoints. One phase 3 trial revealed a novel drug. This was Taurex's leukomethionine, and it's a purported tau aggregation inhibitor. I know that this one has gone through 2 phase 3 trials, and one of them was positive, but still they need to actually run a 3rd one. So that's the only disease-modifying drug among these success stories. And in general, then, I'd say the disease-modifying drugs have not yet returned much by way of positive outcomes, even in this particular time period. And the success were symptom relief therapies. We have one other question. The question is, the life cycle management strategy was commonly employed in AI and CNS therapeutic areas. And can we provide any examples of how that strategy was used within a specific disease area? And within autoimmune, I'm quite familiar with seeing how phase 3 trials are often run after a drug has been approved for something that expands the claims, such as for rheumatoid arthritis. There might be a standard point evaluated for regulatory reasons, ACR 50 or 20, or those sort of evaluations are often the primary endpoints, but then the life cycle management would aim to show additional efficacy outcomes, like demonstrating how radiographic progression might have been slowed down, and longer-term safety as well. So you see that type of study done quite often within autoimmune, and we have a lot of chronic diseases where such things would be important. Yeah, so we do have, looks like a couple of other diseases. What about rare diseases in the category of this analysis?
This is Chris Blazynski. That's a great question. And what we have in Trial Trove right now, we don't cover all rare diseases, but it's an interesting idea, and we certainly could look at that, and we will try to get back to you. And then I see another question, and it has to do with success rates in oncology of targeted therapies versus immunotherapies versus chemotherapies. I don't have an answer to that offhand. However, we do have trial tags for immunotherapies, not for target therapies, but we could tease that out of the data for immunotherapies versus all others. And I don't have the data set up at this time, but we certainly will get back to you with that answer. I wouldn't be surprised if immunotherapies didn't have a far higher success rate. And I do think that a lot of those would be correlated with those patient stratification biomarkers. So I think we did see the success rate there having a big jump. So I think that we would see it, but we can confirm that and get back to you. Well, other than that, there aren't any questions. We thank you for your attention. Those of you who did ask questions, we promise to get you those answers within the week. And we hope you have a very nice day. Goodbye.